Mobile Bay, Alabama isn't a place we usually hear about when we talk about sailboat racing, but they have a huge race every year. 125 boats signed up for the 18-mile sprint down the bay back in 2015. But in one of the biggest sailboat disasters in American racing history, this race would be catastrophic. Since 1959, hundreds of sailors have gathered each spring on Mobile Bay to sprint 18 nautical miles south to Dauphin Island. And these just aren't full-bore racing boats. People turn up on everything from 80s racer cruisers to modern J-boats, right down to Hobie Cats. It's an 18-mile sprint in fairly protected water, so you can really run anything that you want. I was looking over the sailing instructions for this year's race, 2024. This is a document I'm all too familiar with because every race has one, and basically all I do in my free time is race sailboats because I have no life. The rules call for 3 different classes or divisions. Division 1 is monohull, rated on the Portsmouth yardstick. Division 2 is PHRF, which is my division in all my racing experience. And Division 3 is multi-hull. And they get some cool multi-hulls like Corsair trimarans, some big fast cats, and even the humble Hobie Cat. Now, I have a Hobie 16, and the thought of racing at 18 miles is tempting, but I'd need to be in way better physical shape. That's 2 to 3 hours of trapeze time on one pontoon like a rocket ship. Although participation in this race has dwindled in recent years, Buccaneer Yacht Club and Mobile Yacht Club, along with platinum sponsor Michelob Ultra this year, are revving the race up, trying to get it back to its glory days when over 300 boats would fill the bay. The Dauphin Island Regatta is more than just a race, though. It's a 3-day festival featuring food and local bands and activities. It's a very big deal. In 2015, the race was scheduled for Saturday, April 25th. April is well outside of hurricane season in that part of the world, and the weather is usually pretty good. Because this bay is not straight up ocean racing conditions, it's protected by a line of barrier islands that cut the waves down, and the size of the bay usually keeps things fairly civilized. The average depth of the bay is just 10 feet deep, which kind of perks my ears up. For most of my life, I've been a Great Lakes racer, and the shallow depth means that when waves do kick up, they tend to kick up fast and sharp and very close together. Shallow usually means bumpy. Of the 125 boats registered, a lot of the articles that are written on this thing focus on the story of one of the Hobie Cats. On board the Kyla, a Hobie 16, Ron and Hannah practiced trapezing. He tethered his hip harness to the boat, then leaned back over the water as the boat tilted and the hull under their feet went airborne. We call this running on one tune. They made an interesting crew. Ron was in his 50s and had been sailing his whole life, while Hannah, his daughter's friend, was just 15 years old and had never been on a sailboat before. To me, that speaks to how protected this race usually is. An 18-mile long race on a protected body of water is usually an extremely safe place to sail, and lots of kids were on the race boats for this race. This isn't competitive ocean racing, it's just a very large club race. It's for families. I'd wager that you'd even find a dog or two if you search the boats. The Dauphin Island Regatta first took place more than a half-century ago and hasn't really changed much since. One day each spring, sailors gather in central Mobile Bay and sprint 18 nautical miles south to the island near the mouth of the bay in the Gulf of Mexico. There were other boats like Ron's too, Hobie Cats that could be pulled onto the beach by hand, they're so light. There were also sleek purpose-built race boats with oversized rigs and big ocean-going vessels with plush cabins below decks. Their captains were just as varied in skill and experience as the boats were. A ripple of discontent, however, moved through the crews as the boats circled, waiting that morning. The day before, the National Weather Service had issued a warning. A few strong, severe storms are possible on Saturday, and the main threat is damaging wind. Now at 7:44 a.m., as sailors began to gather on the bay for the 9:30 start, the yacht club's website suddenly posted a message about the race in red script, canceled due to inclement weather. The sailors on the boats had their phones and computers, and they saw the message. A few minutes later, at 7:57 a.m., the National Weather Service in Mobile sent out a message on Twitter: "Don't let your guard down today. More storms are possible across the area late this afternoon." But at 8:10 a.m., strangely, the yacht club removed the cancellation notice and insisted the regatta was still on. Gary Gardner, then the Commodore of Fairhope Yacht Club, which was hosting the regatta that year, said the cancellation was a mistake, the result of a garbled VHF message. When an official on the water in one of the boats called into the club's office via VHF, post the scratch sheet, Gardner said in an interview with the Smithsonian, the person who took the call heard "scratch the race" and posted a cancellation notice. Immediately, the Fairhope Yacht Club received calls from all the other clubs around the bay. "Is the race canceled?" "No, no, no," Gardner said. The Fairhope organizers told everybody the race is not canceled. The confusion ended up delaying the start of the race by an hour. Usually in massive disasters like this, the cause is found to be a series of mistakes or random happenings. And this is the first one. The miscommunication caused the race to delay by an hour. Had it started on time, the boats may have finished before the storm arrived. But they didn't. Then the race time finally came around, but they had a false start and had to delay the start again, half an hour lost this time. The boats were circling the start line at 10:45 a.m. when the National Weather Service issued a more dire prediction. Thunderstorms will move in from the west this afternoon and across the marine area. Some of the thunderstorms may be strong or severe, with gusty winds and large hail being the primary threat. Commodore Gardner later said, "We all knew it was a storm coming. It's no big deal for us to see a weather report that says scattered thunderstorms or even scattered severe thunderstorms. If you want to go race sailboats and long distance race, you're going to get into some storms." And he's right. I've done 25-mile races all in the rain. It's a miserable experience, but it's what we do. Now, the yacht clubs and organizers could have canceled the race because of the warnings about weather. They chose not to. I've been in races like this. In fact, I was the race chair for my yacht club and was in this position a few times. You see the weather warnings, you study the wind and the waves, and you look at everything religiously, and ultimately you have to make a decision. If you decide to cancel, half the race teams will yell at you and tease you for being a chicken. Some of these guys won't cancel for anything. I once canceled the race because the wind was going to 25 knots, gusting to 40, and 4 of the boats went and raced anyway. Even though the race was officially canceled, they couldn't earn any points for going and racing, but they still did. Some sailors are just really hardcore. They all sailed fine and teased me endlessly for canceling the race afterwards. So the yacht clubs themselves on Mobile Bay and the organizers did not cancel the race, but given all the warnings and forecasts, 8 of the participating 125 boats decided not to race. They backed out. Ultimately, no matter what the organizers of a race say, the skipper has the final say if their boat will be going or not, and 8 of them opted to head back in to safe harbor. On board the Razor, a 24-foot boat, a 17-year-old Leonard, his father, and 3 of his friends scrutinized the incoming weather reports in granular detail. They decided that the storm looked likely to arrive at about 4:15 p.m., which should give them time to run down to Dauphin Island, cross the finish line, spin around, and return back to their home port before the storm got there. Leonard felt thrilled as the race started. He and his father, Robert, had bought the Razor as a half-sunken lost cause and spent a year rebuilding her. Now the 5 crew members smiled at each other. For the first time, they agreed they had the boat dialed in just right. They felt very confident. They timed their start with precision, no hesitation at the line, and then led the field for the first half hour. But the small catamarans were among the fastest boats there. If you've ever been on a Hobie, you know what I mean. And Kayla hurtled Hannah and Ron forward. On the open water, Hannah felt herself relax a little bit. 15 years old, never been on the boat, but she says everything kind of slowed down. She and Ron passed a 36-foot monohull sailboat called Wind Nuts, captained by Ron's lifelong friend Scott. "Hey," Ron called out, waving. Not so long ago, before we had sophisticated weather radars on our boats, satellite navigation and onboard computers and racing apps on our phone, sailors had little choice but to be cautious. As James Delgado, a maritime historian and former scientist at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, puts it, They gave nature a wider berth back then because we didn't know what would happen. While new information technology generally does enhance the safety of sailing, it can, paradoxically, bring problems of its own, especially when its dazzling precision encourages boaters to think that they can evade danger with just minutes to spare. Today, Delgado says, sometimes we tickle the dragon's tail, and the dragon may be stirring, since many scientists warn that climate change is likely to increase the number of extraordinary storms that we don't predict. Within a few hours of the start of the 2015 Dauphin Island Regatta, as the boats were streaking toward the finish line, the storm front reached a port in Mississippi, 40 miles southwest of Mobile. It slammed into the side of Manama, a 600-foot oil tanker weighing almost 57,000 tons, and heaved it aground. This wasn't just a thunderstorm anymore. Mobile Bay, about 30 miles long and half as wide, is fed from the north by 5 rivers, so that depending on the tide and inland rains, the bay sometimes smells like sea salt, and on other days of river silt. A deep shipping channel runs up the center, but much of the bay is so shallow an adult could stand on the muddy bottom. On the northwestern shore stands the city of Mobile, dotted with shining high-rises. South of the city is a working waterfront, shipyards and docks. Across the bay on the eastern side, a high bluff features a string of picturesque towns: Daphne, Fairhope, Point Clear. To the south, the mouth of the bay is guarded by Dauphin Island and Fort Morgan Peninsula. Between them is a gap of just 3 miles across of open water leading to the vast Gulf of Mexico. During the first half of the race, Hannah and Ron chased his brother Shane, who sailed on an identical Hobie. Halfway through the race, he made a bold move. Instead of sailing straight toward Dauphin Island, the shortest route, he tacked due west over to the shore where the water was smoother and better protected, and then turned south. It worked. "We're smoking," he told Hannah. Conditions were ideal at that point at around noon, with high winds but smooth water over by the shore. About 2 p.m., as they arrived at the finish line, the teenager Hannah looked back and laughed. Ron's brother was a minute behind them. "Hey, we won," she said. Typically, once crews finish the race, they pull into the harbor at Dauphin Island for a trophy ceremony and a night's rest. But the Gaston brothers decided, both of them on Hobies, to turn around and sail back home, assuming they could do that before the storm hit. Other people made the same choice and followed them. The brothers headed north along the bay's western shore. During the race, Ron had used an out-of-service iPhone to track their location on a map. He slipped it into a pocket and sat back on the trampoline. Shortly before 3 p.m., he and Hannah watched as storm clouds rolled toward them from the west. A heavy downpour blurred the western horizon, as though someone had smudged it with an eraser. "We may get some rain," Ron said with characteristic understatement. But they seemed to be making good time. Maybe they could make it to the Buccaneer Yacht Club, he thought, before the rain would hit them. Hannah glanced again and again at the handheld GPS that she was holding and was amazed at the speeds they were clocking. 13 knots now. Eventually, she looped its cord around her neck so she could keep an eye on it and tucked the GPS into her life preserver so she wouldn't drop it. By now, the storm, which had first come alive in Texas, had crossed 3 states to reach the western edge of Mobile Bay. At the National Weather Service office in Mobile, meteorologists watched the storm advance on the radar. It really intensified as it hit the bay, recalls Jason Beeman, the meteorologist in charge of coordinating the office's warnings that day. Beeman noted the unusual way the storm, rather than blow itself out quickly, kept gaining strength. It was like an engine, like a machine that kept running, he said. It was feeding itself. Storms of this strength epitomize the dangers posed by a climate that may be increasingly characterized by extreme weather. Thornton said it wouldn't be scientifically appropriate to attribute any storm to climate change, but said there is a growing consensus that climate change is increasing the frequency of severe storms. Beeman suggests more research should be devoted to better understanding what's driving individual storms. The technology we have now just isn't advanced enough to give us the answer, he says. On Mobile Bay, the downburst sent an invisible wave of air rolling ahead of the storm front. This strange new wind pushed Ron and Hannah's little Hobie faster than they'd ever gone at any point in the race, and then lightning cracked. "Don't touch anything metal," Ron told Hannah. They huddled on the center of the boat's trampoline. Sailors along the edges of the bay had reached a decisive moment. "This is the time to just pull into shore," one of the captains, Thornton, said. "Anywhere, any shore, any gap where you can climb out of the boat and onto land. They're going to ditch the boats." Ron tried. He scanned the shore for a place where his catamaran could pull onto a beach if needed. Bulkhead, bulkhead, pier, bulkhead, he thought. The walled-off western side of the bay offered no harbor, even for his little Hobie 16. Less than 2 miles behind him, his brother Shane, along with Shane's sons Connor, disappeared out of sight behind a curtain of rain. Maybe we can outrun it, Ron told Hannah. But the storm was charging toward them at 60 knots now. The world's fastest boats, giant carbon fiber experimental racecraft in the America's Cup flying on foils above the water, requiring their crew to wear helmets, couldn't outrun this storm. Lightning flickered in every direction now, and within moments the rain caught up with them. It came so fast and so dense that the world seemed reduced to a small gray room with no horizon, no sky, no shore, and no sea. There was only their boat and the needle pricks of the rain coming down. The temperature tumbled as the downburst cascaded through the atmosphere. Hannah noticed the sudden cold, her legs shaking in the wind. Then, without warning, the gale dropped to nothing. No wind. Ron said, "What in the world?" But a spontaneous roar drowned out his voice. The boat shuddered and shook, and then a wall of air hit them with a force unlike anything Ron had ever encountered in his whole lifetime of sailing. The winds rose to 73 miles an hour suddenly, hurricane strength, and came across the bay in a straight line like an invisible tsunami. Ron and Hannah never even had a moment to get the sails down. The front of the Hobie 16 Kyla rose up from the water so that it stood up for an instant on its tail, and then it flipped sideways. The bay was only 7 feet deep at that spot, so the mast jabbed into the mud and snapped in half. Hannah flew off, hitting her head on the boom. Ron landed in between her and the boat and grabbed her with one hand and one of the lines attached to the boat with the other hand. The boat now lay in the water on its side, and the trampoline caught the wind like a sail, and as it blew away, it pulled Ron through the water away from Hannah, stretching his arms until he faced a decision that seemed surreal. In that elongated moment, he had two options. He could let go of the boat, or he could let go of Hannah. He let go of the boat, and in seconds, it blew away beyond the walls of gray. They couldn't see it anymore. The room seemed to shrink with each moment. Hannah extended an arm and realized she couldn't see beyond her own fingers. And she and Ron, both still wearing their life jackets, but 8-foot swells crashing on top of them, threatening to separate them or drown them on the surface. The two wrapped their arms around each other, and Hannah tucked her head against Ron's chest to find a pocket of air free from the piercing rain.
I can't tell you what was going through my mind other than the fact that, okay, I was on a boat, now I'm in the water, and the boat's gone.
In the chaos, Ron thought for a moment of his daughter, but as he and Hannah rolled together like a barrel under the waves, his mind was blank and as gray as the seascape. About 30 miles north, a Coast Guard ensign named Philip McNamara stood his first ever shift as duty officer. As the storm bore down on Mobile Bay, distress calls started to come in from along the coast, from sailors in the water. People stranded on sandbars, frantic witnesses on land. Several times he called his boss, Commander Chris Cederholm, for advice about how to respond to the emergency, each time with increasing urgency. A dozen Coast Guard ships from Mississippi to Florida responded, along with several airplanes, helicopters, and a team of searchers who prowled the coastline on all-terrain vehicles. People on horses searched the bay's clay banks for survivors. At the Coast Guard outpost down on Dauphin Island, Bannon, the Marine Resources Officer, made call after call to the families and friends of the boat owners and captains, as he could find their numbers, trying to work out how many people might be missing. You see, the regatta organizers kept a tally of the captains, but not of the other people who were on the boats, and that's fairly common. Cederholm, the Coast Guard commander, alerted the military chain of command all the way up to a 3-star Admiral William Lee. "I've never seen anything like this," the 34-year-old veteran of the sea told Cederholm. Near the Dauphin Island Bridge, a Coast Guard rescue boat picked up Sarah Gaston and James Gates. She had suffered a leg injury and hypothermia as their boat sunk, and they pulled her up on deck, and she went into shock. Ron and Hannah were close to the middle of the bay, where the likelihood of rescue is frighteningly low. "All you can really see above the water is someone's head," Bannon explained later. "A human head is about the size of a coconut, so you're on a ship that's moving, looking for a coconut bobbing in between the waves. You can easily pass within a few feet and never see someone in the water." Ron and Hannah had now been in the water for 2 hours. They tried to swim for shore, but the waves and current locked them in place. To stave off the horror of their predicament, Hannah made jokes. "I don't think we're going to make it home for dinner," she said. "Look," Ron said, pulling the old iPhone out of his pocket. Even though it was out of service, he could still use it to make an emergency call. At the same moment, Hannah pulled the GPS unit from her life jacket and held it up. Ron struggled with his wet fingers to dial the phone. "Here," he said, handing it to Hannah, "you're the teenager." She called 911 and a dispatcher answered, "What's your emergency and location?" And she said, "I'm in Mobile Bay." "The Bay Area?" "No, ma'am, I'm in the bay, in the water." Using the phone and the GPS and watching the blue lights of the patrol boats, Hannah guided the rescuers to their location. An officer pulled her from the water and onto the deck of the rescue boat, and the scaffolding of Hannah's sense of humor started to collapse. She asked, "This boat isn't going to capsize too, is it?" Ron's brother and nephew, Shane and Connor, had also gone overboard. 3 times the wind flipped their boat on its side before it eventually broke the mast. They used a small jib sail to fight their way toward the western shore. Once on land, they knocked on someone's door, borrowed a phone, and called the Coast Guard to report that they'd survived. The 3-man crew on a boat clung to a life ring, treading water until they were rescued. 10 vessels sank or were destroyed by the storm. 40 people were rescued by the Coast Guard. A half-dozen sailors died. It was one of the worst sailing disasters in American history. Working with the Coast Guard, which is currently investigating the disaster, regatta organizers have adopted more stringent safety measures, including keeping better records of boat crews and passenger information during races. The Coast Guard also determined that some people died because they couldn't quickly find and put on their life preservers, which were buried under gear or down below. So now it requires racers to wear life jackets during the beginning of the race on the assumption that even if they do take them off later, they were recently worn and they'll be close at hand. Like many races in the US and Canada too, the regatta was governed by the rules of US sailing, whose handbook for race organizers is unambiguous. If foul weather threatens, or there is any reason to suspect that the weather will deteriorate, for example, lightning or a heavy squall, making conditions unsafe for sailing or for your operations, the prudent and practical thing to do is to abandon the race. The manual outlines the responsibility of the group designated to run the race, known as the race committee, during regattas in which professionals and hobbyists converge. The race committee's job is to exercise good judgment, not win a popularity contest. Make your decisions based on consideration of all competitors, especially the least experienced or least capable competitors. For its part, the Coast Guard, according to an internal memo about this investigation, notes that the race's delayed start contributed to the tragedy. This caused confusion among the race participants and led to a 1-hour delay. The first race boat finished at approximately 1350. At approximately 1508, severe thunderstorms consisting of hurricane-force winds and steep waves swept across the western shores of Mobile Bay. For many of the sailors themselves, once their boats were all rigged up and they were out there on the water, it was easy to assume that the weather information they had was accurate and that the storm would behave in a predictable way. Given the access that racers had to forecast that morning, Thornton, the meteorologist, said the best thing at that point would be to stay home. But even when people have decent information, he added, they let their decision-making get clouded. "We all struggle with this," said Bert Rogers. He's the executive director of Tall Ships America, which is a not-profit sail training association. There is this tension between technology and traditional esoteric skills. The technology does save lives, but it could distract people and give them a false sense of confidence. That's something we're talking about now. Now, the mission here at Lady K Sailing has always been to get more people sailing more easily, and I don't tell you this story to scare you away. Sailing can and usually is very safe and an amazing experience. I tell you this story because I think as safe as we make things, we have to keep these stories in the back of our heads when we make decisions. Don't be afraid to wait to stay in safe harbor if the weather's threatening, and know your limitations. It's better to miss the race than to have the worst happen. On my 15,000-pound boat, my rules are pretty simple. Sustained winds up to 22 knots are acceptable with a good crew. With leisure sailing and non-sailors on board, sustained winds up to 18 are acceptable. On my Hobie Cap, winds up to 15. I pitch poled this summer in 25, and I don't care to repeat that without a helmet. On my Laser, winds up to 15. But I also teach kids how to sail. I have a CL-14 that we take out, and it's a very good training tool, and we'll only go out in winds up to about 18 or 20. I make conservative decisions, and I play it safe. In support of the mission of getting more people sailing more easily, I want to thank the patrons who give as little as a couple of bucks an episode so that I can keep making these videos. Thank you so very much. If you'd like to help out, please consider becoming a patron. Until next week, friends, keep the heavy side down, but Not too far down. We'll see you.